Hi everybody, sorry I've been offline for several days. Today is actually Shabbat, and if you know what that is, that's this original term for Sabbath. That's the end of the week, the end of 7 days. The seventh day is symbolic for the time that God rested after He created the world. Doesn't mean the whole universe, I'm not sure, but at least as far as our neck of the woods in this part of the galaxy. That's a belief system, and on Sabbath you reconfirm that you believe that. You say the prayers, and as a technical rule, I shouldn't be doing any videos on the Sabbath, but in fact it is almost Shekiah, the sunset, and the Sabbath will be ending and the new week will begin, and I'm just a little bit bending the rules right now. I would have done this video several days ago, so only God knows if this is a terrible sin. I don't encourage it in anyone. But anyhow, talking about Muslims who are somewhat related to Jews, who are somewhat related to Christians, with the Christians being in between, since they were the second one that occurred about 2,000 years ago, and the Muslims have occurred in the past 1,400 years, approximately, since the advent of Muhammad. Now, this is not exactly just about the Muslims, but in Egypt, that's the majority religion. Although I have heard that Muslims are protesting alongside with the Christians. Now, what this is really about is to give you another perspective on things. What would you be doing if you were in Cairo right now? What would I be doing? What would I be doing? Would I be taking off my glasses and looking around and making myself known? Would I be taking part in the riots? Would I be protecting the mummies? I just kind of look at it in terms of what's this going to do to the rest of the world, since we aren't there, but it may have far-reaching implications. So they say, politically. Now, you obviously know the Suez Canal is the one that joins the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. So the Persian Gulf and all the oil-producing region of the world can transport through that canal, heading north up into the Mediterranean. Therefore, they can reach North Africa and Europe and the North Atlantic. And it's easier for them than going around the Horn of Africa and down around South Africa and up again through the entire Atlantic. So the Suez Canal has obvious transportation advantages. It has obvious strategic importance to the military, especially the navies. There's just talk whether it's going to destabilize. I don't know. Is it going to destabilize if they change the regime? Well, take a look at this. What is behind the regime change that everybody's talking about? What is behind the protests? What is the spark? As I mentioned in my other video, there's obviously something behind all this. There's some power behind this. And what does the Obama administration have to do with it? So, exactly how do you get mass protests occurring? Just like they did a few years ago in Iran. Less than a few years ago, actually. Less than 2 years ago. How does this happen? How do you just pull the plug out and foment this type of thing? Well, to be quite honest with you, they have studied this for the past 50 years or more, and this type of destabilization through propaganda and through mass media manipulation, which basically is the same as propaganda. The media is used as a tool of political designs. It's a plutarchy, and that's what's going on. Somebody wants the government to be destabilized, and somebody is against Mubarak, and somebody wants another guy in. And these are just factions. This is not a black and white world. These are factions. And at the same time, you see Israel, who would seem to be the other side of the Muslim powers, and they don't want Mubarak removed because they're saying, well, after all, he was a good friend to Israel and he kept the peace. So how are we supposed to take that? A lot of right-wing Israeli groups are saying that Obama has abandoned Mubarak, and this is not something that they agree with. This is not a wise move. So, ultimately, what does this mean for the rest of the world and the United States and places like Canada, places like Australia, and places like the Far East, China, and Japan? Does it really matter? Well, it matters to the extent that it's going to affect military posturing, it's going to affect the economy. So everybody's kind of looking. It seems to be a major story in that sense, but when I get the feeling that, oh, it's such a major thing, I have to double check. I have to stop and say, oh, wait a second, is it really such a major thing? What else could possibly be going on right now that they could use Egypt as a distraction? What could be going on? I don't know. I'm not saying that I know something. I'm not privy to anything necessarily. But along the same lines of how this can affect the rest of the world, look at just the close neighbors. Saudi Arabia, supposedly according to some sources that I look into, they're shaking in their boots. The Saud regime is looking at the possibility that they're going to get in some hot water, that they're going to be destabilized. Jordan has already responded with concessions to its people to avoid protests. Yemen is also in another way involved and being influenced by what's going on in Egypt. Syria I haven't heard about. But you see, from a careful observation of history, you would notice that things change. There are such things as fair weather friends in the world. President Roosevelt understood this very well in his diplomatic wisdom. It's not in human nature to keep its word. And when you give word to somebody at the get-go, because you're hoping to strike a deal and create a scenario, that scenario that you've just set up is going to be undermined because the people are going to turn around and they're not going to keep their word. Nobody in the world today, no nation, keeps their word unless it's at the threat of violence. And this is the name of the game of the Cold War because obviously this is the threat of nuclear attack that's kept everybody in line. And that's the way Israel does it, especially over there. That's why Egypt would even want to continue with its peace treaty. Egypt is the biggest military might that could go against Israel at any time. But what about this fear talk that the right-wingers are doing, that even the left is doing? And as you know, I don't really go with the right-wing, left-wing dichotomy. I don't really believe that it's accurate. I believe it's a very superficial, inaccurate way of looking at things. Like I said, there are multiple factions, and there are blocks of power that shift, like shifting sands of the Sahara. Everything's always changing. Just to leave you with a case in point, back in the days when Israel was a new nation, after their acceptance into the United Nations, 1941 to 1949, that period, you're going into the 50s, early 50s, the best friend of Israel was supposedly Iran. And then you had all this stuff going on with Iran fighting with Iraq. That was a big war with many casualties. It was a bloody conflict. It was very horrific as far as we've heard. You don't get a lot of information about it because it just wasn't covered in the media as much as, let's say Vietnam or something, which is just prior to that. But the Iran thing got settled, and then Iran came more into the favor of the rest of the Muslims, of the so-called terrorist organizations. And then they turned against Israel. But if you do a careful study of history, you'll see that alliances are always changing. One day you're going to have a friend, the other day it's going to be an enemy. So keep that in mind when you're following everything that's going on with this whole Egypt revolution.